Good morning, everyone. So now we enter the home stretch of the 1 cent small queen with the Second Ottawa period. Now, as I discussed in my overview video for the small queens, I've divided the Second Ottawa period up into early, middle, and late periods. So the period I'm going to talk about in this video is the very early Second Ottawa period. And this would cover 1889 up until about 1892, before the new plates were introduced in 1893. So one of the things that we would expect to see in this period is impressions that are somewhat worn, at least to the extent that the individual details of the ornaments in the corners are not visible as distinct and clear and separate lines. The Montreal Gazette period, which is 1888, would have perforations of 12 and a quarter, 12 or 12.1 in compounds thereof. So we would expect in this period those perforations to give way to combinations of 12, 12.1, 12.2, and so forth. And indeed they do. Now, the plates used during this period will not have any position dots anywhere. So no dots in the lower left corner, no medallion dots. But the biggest tell for this period will be the papers. So what I have discussed initially when talking about Ottawa versus Montreal is that Ottawa printings always have a porous paper that has a high degree of surface porosity, or at least some degree of it, what I would call semi-porous. Usually, even with a semi-porous paper, there will be some loosening of fibers on the top of the paper and some stray fibers visible under magnification, which is not the case in any of the Montreal papers. Now, this is a gradual process with the Second Ottawa period. So the very earliest printings are on papers that resemble in many respects the late Montreal papers in the sense that they have distinct mesh generally. All the papers I found in this period are all horizontal wove. So the vertical wove is not in this period, and it doesn't reappear until the next period, and even then it's very, very scarce. From this point on, most of the Second Ottawa papers are horizontal wove papers, which is an interesting characteristic. But the papers during this period also have a felt side that shows some degree of surface porosity, but it's not the degree of porosity that you see on the newsprint that's used later on. We see the first beginnings of a toned, poorer quality paper, but it's not yet newsprint. It still has some structure. It's still fairly smooth on the surface. There's a paper that is kind of grayish cream that has a soft, silky feel again. It's not as silky as the first Ottawa stamps or some of the early Montreals, but it's softer than the Montreal papers. So the glide test that I talked about doing, actually, which I'm now doing with a stamp, it comes back into play. Now this stamp here is an 1891 cancel, so it falls into this period. And so we see some reappearance of that type of paper. But the key distinction in this period is that most all of these papers, except for the tone paper, are thin. Thinner than they are in the Montreal period. They're not noticeably thin, but they're thin when you feel them against your fingers. So if you if you click this stamp like this, and you just sort of feel it on your fingers, it just feels thinner than the paper that's in the Montreal period. And it doesn't have the hardness that the paper had before. So the idea of stout paper, stiff, hard paper, that gives way during this period. The papers are all soft. Now, I don't have as many dated cancellations here as I would like to be able to cover all the years. And in fact, I've noticed that when I'm sorting small queens, I very rarely see certain dates. So I very rarely come across 1890 dates or 1889 dates in my travels and exploration with these stamps. And I think having dated cancels from those 2 years would be very useful for nailing down all the varieties in this period. The earliest dates I seem to see are 1891s and 1892s, and they're usually all CDSs. And they're not that common. I mean, the more common dates that you see in a random lot of 1 cent small queens for Ottawas is you see lots of 1893, 94, 95, 96. But you don't see really very many 91s and 92s. But I've got some here to show you. In terms of shades, it would appear that the earliest Second Ottawas from 1891 to 92 are mostly this sort of greenish lemon yellow, sort of a very pale washed out yellow. Then we get a deeper yellow that appears, and it's kind of a vibrant deep yellow. And I'm not sure which one comes first, whether it's the deep yellow and the vibrant yellow or the sort of washed out yellow, but those are the two main shades that I see in here, and I'll show you in a sec what I've sorted out. So I'll just take the camera now, actually. Take it off the tripod and flip it around. So here, I've got this. So this paper here, these might actually be very late Montreal, but I've classified them as early Ottawa because the paper here is slightly porous on the surface. Although this paper is very, very close to the thinner horizontal wove with coarse mesh paper in the late Montreal period. This is the soft paper that I talked about with the silky feel. It's very nondescript. It has very little to any visible mesh unless you hold it up to backlight. Then we get the paper over here. So these yellows here were the sort of greenish lemon yellow. That's sort of a bright yellow, but not too deep. Then over here we get the deeper yellow, and we get kind of a brownish sort of cream toned paper that's thicker. Again, it has sort of medium horizontal mesh, but there's some surface porosity to this. And then over here, some dated 1892s in the pale yellow here. And then we've got brighter and deeper yellow up here. Now this paper here is more, it's similar to this paper here, but it's not soft to the touch. And it has a slightly more pronounced mesh than this one does. And then over here, this is the paper that looks white on the back, but otherwise is very similar to this paper. Or this paper, I should say, and that the mesh is not really visible. It's slightly porous on the surface. Now, in terms of perforations, I measured these, and most of them come out at 12, combinations of 12 and 12.1 or 12.2. And I see the reappearance here of the 11.9 gauge on a couple of the examples. And that's a measurement we didn't see since the first Ottawa period. It makes its reappearance here, although it doesn't seem to be that common. So that gives you an overview of the early printings from this period. Next, what I'll look at will be the mid Second Ottawa period, which will cover about 1893 up to 1895 or so. And that's going to cover the majority of the Second Ottawa printings that you're going to see. Fairly limited range of papers and shades on those. And, you'll see very clearly, I think, after you view these next couple of videos, how to weed out most of the Second Ottawa printings from a lot of small queens that you have. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.